Hi, I'm Larry Puckett, the DCC Guy. Today, as I promised, we're going to take a look at lubricating steam locomotives. Bachmann, in particular, has really done a lot for bringing back the popularity of steam over the last 20 years or so. And they make some very nice running locomotives. So I'm going to take a look at this Bachmann 482 Light USRA locomotive, and it's representative of what Bachmann has available for the North American market at least. The European market, they're a little bit different, and I'll get into that in a future video. Before we move on though, I'm going to ask you one more time, please consider subscribing to the channel, and you'll get notifications when I post new videos. Other than that, let's go ahead. I'm going to zoom in and we'll get started. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started on lubricating this Bachmann light mountain. I've already removed the screws. You can see there's 3 positions here where there were small screws that held this cover plate in place. Now this is comparable to the cover plate on the bottom of the Athearn and Atlas trucks. So once you remove those little guys, then you have to ease this out because there are these small bronze, phosphor bronze springs that make contact with the inside of the wheels and give you electrical pickup. So those, you have to ease them up out of there, and they don't come out easily, let me tell you. But they will come out of there. And then you can see the metal contacts here on the bottom that carry electricity back and make contact underneath here. What we have here then is a basic design. It has 1 geared driver, and then the rest, I believe, I'll show you that, are all powered off of the drive rods that are interconnecting between the different drivers. Also, you know, this one is sprung. The rest of them are not. They just kind of float in this metal block that is the chassis. And there are no specific bearings like there were on the Athearn locomotive. Instead, they just sit, the axles just sit in this metal block here. And so they basically just are a metal-on-metal bearing contact. So those need lubricating periodically. Now you'll note that there, you might be able to see it, there is some lubricant on these already. I have not lubricated these since they came from the factory a number of years ago. So at least at the point when they were making these, they were lubricating them. I'll go ahead and add a little bit more just to make sure. And you'll notice it's also a white grease. Let me point out one other thing about the Hobby Lube white grease L657 and also this Label 107. Both of these are plastic compatible. And that's something to be aware of when you are purchasing lubricants to use with your models. You don't want to be using any greases or oils that are not plastic compatible. You don't want to degrade your parts. And even though this is going to be a metal-on-metal type contact, this is a plastic gear right here. So you don't want to be introducing non-compatible materials where they might also come into contact with these gears and other parts of your locomotive. So as a general rule, I just use plastic compatible lubricants everywhere, and it's just safer. So basically all you need to do is put just a little dab on each one of these, the axles and that one main gear. And that will get them lubricated, and you'll be good to go for another 1,000 miles, I said. let me go ahead. I need to put this back together because I want to flip it over. Basically, though, to put this back together, I put that one piece in there and then just slide this back in place. It goes in easier than it came out by a long shot. But you do want to make sure that you don't get any of these little wipers bent, because you want them to give you good electrical pickup up and down the gear tray. Okay, let me go ahead and put this all back together and flip it over. Okay, I've got the cover plate reinserted, and now I'm just tightening up the screw here. The first one in the center. And we'll go up here and get this one. You don't want to over tighten these. Just get them in there good and tight, but don't strip them doing it. Ah, good. Didn't lose anything in the process. Okay. Wipe off any little lube that got here as a result of my fingers getting grease on them. Okay, so that's all there is to that part. Now, let's flip this over. Before I move on, I want to say that I am not going to talk about lubricating motor bearings on these locomotives. The reason for that is these use what's called a split frame design. You can see there's two large metal weights that are cast to fit inside the boiler. And the motor here sits in the middle of this. So there is no way, and I've looked at this and tried, there's no way to get down in here and add lubrication. In reading the instructions, the only thing that Bachmann says that you might need to lubricate, of course, are the various bearings on the wheels and the like. So I'm going to show you how to do that. If you ever do get a very, very noisy motor, then I would definitely suspect the motor bearings need lubricating. And in that case, you're going to have to open this thing up. It's not something that's easy to do. Particularly, it's easier to get it apart initially and get that weight out. But then trying to get it apart and get it back together again so that it's going to run properly, it's just not something that's easy to do. And you might need to send it into Bachmann even. I've never ever had to take one of these suckers apart to lubricate the motor. So hopefully they've done a very good job in China lubricating those motor bearings because it's not something for the faint of heart or the novice to try to accomplish. Okay, so where do you then, okay, we've done the bearings on the main axles. We've done the gear down in there. So what's left? Well, there are a number of bearings that can also get noisy. Specifically, there are bearings down in here on each end of these pony truck wheels. There aren't any direct bearings, but you can still put a drop of oil on the bearings on the lead truck axles so that those are properly lubricated and will stand up to running over time. Another thing that is all of these metal-to-metal surfaces in the valve gear can periodically use a little bit of oil. Anything that moves, just barely wet it with oil. I mean, just barely. That's more than I wanted to put on there. Okay, so you just want enough to make sure that there is no friction in here. And places like this where you have a screw going through the valve gear, it's good to lubricate that so that it doesn't back out and drop off on you. I've had that happen at least one time. And lubricating it is all it took once I put the screw back in. So you're going to lubricate all of these little joints. You know, this is something you do very rarely because they just don't need a lot of oil. And another problem with having too much oil is that it can get down on your drivers and end up with your locomotive slipping on slopes and even on flat track if you're pulling a lot of cars. Another thing, don't forget your tender. These tender wheels can add a lot of drag. They can also develop a very annoying squeak if you ignore them. So basically, you just want to, again, get this little metal tip down in there at the end of the axles where there is a bearing cup, and put just a touch of oil down in those locations. And if you ever hear any wheels squeaking as the train is running, then that's a good indication that you need to do some lubrication there. And it's a fairly straightforward process to do that. I think that Bachmann is really taking the lead in producing locomotives for the vast majority of the hobby. You have companies like BLI that are also churning out a lot of more expensive high-end locomotives. They have some now that are made of brass, but with these metal chassis that run beautifully. At some point in the future, if there's enough of a demand, I would consider go ahead and taking a look at lubricating brass locomotives. I still have a couple of brass locomotives. I don't run them very often, to say the least. They are just require too much maintenance, and it's one reason I got rid of most of my brass fleet years ago, simply because of maintenance issues. That's about all I have. Most of the market are now using this type of split frame design, similar to what Bachmann has used. I think Athearn at one time used that in some of their locomotives. So it just is a way to add a lot of weight and a lot of pulling power to the mechanism. So be very careful when you're lubricating these things. Don't get a lot of oil and grease all over the place, or that they won't run properly for you in the end. Well, that about wraps it up with respect to lubricating steam locomotives. It's not all that difficult. There's, limited access to get to the motor, which is unfortunate, but it's one of the facts of life with respect to this split chassis design. So it's been my experience, though, that these typically don't need motor bearing lubrication all that frequently. However, I do recommend regular lubricating the valve gear, the running gear, the whole 9 yards on the locomotive, and also the bearings on the other wheels as well. So don't forget those, and don't forget your tender. So go ahead, keep track though. Probably a good idea to keep a notebook or an index card on each one of your locomotives and record information like, when you purchased it, what kind of decoder you have in it, if you have one, and things like the last time you lubricated it, so that you can have a pretty good idea of how often you do need to lubricate these. That's about all I have with respect to these. So have a good weekend, and we'll start off next week. I haven't decided exactly what that video is going to be about, but I'll come up with something over the weekend. In the meantime, enjoy.